Thank you very much, Miriam. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm very happy to be with you this evening, but I must confess at the outset that it is very difficult to follow Dr. Perkin and Dr. Forsman. So it is, I think, with a gigantic leap of faith that I stand before you tonight. As you can see from the topic, I've taken a very broad approach. There are some major limitations to this kind of approach, but I hope that there will be one or two advantages for us as a group. Many of the ideas that I wish to share with you tonight require much more analysis and development, and thus much more time than we have available to us this evening. For example, we could spend the next hour discussing the word spiritual and all the problems associated with that word. But I have chosen, I think, to paint a portrait with a 6-inch brush. First of all, I want to congratulate the Acadia Divinity College on the 25th anniversary of its reconstitution in 1968. I want to wish the faculty, the staff, the students, and the board members continued success in the important work that you are doing. I am both honored and challenged by the invitation to participate in the Hayward Lecture series. I am honored for obvious reasons. It is apparent that the Hayward Lectures have been an important source of insight and scholarship, especially in the area of biblical and theological reflection. I am challenged as a psychologist and educator with a minimal background in theology to provide a perspective on the important topic of faith, especially in the company of noted scholars in the area. I was, of course, anxious about accepting the invitation to participate in the lecture series. While my lack of scholarship in the area of faith might be sufficient reason for my anxiety, it occurred to me that my fear and its resolution were a good example of what I would like to share about faith. That is, if faith is a trust or confidence in the unknown, then fear is its opposite, and fear must be resolved if one is to grow in faith. Hopefully my personal vignette will become clearer to you in the next few moments. Suffice it to say for now that my presence here this evening is hopefully a sign that faith is still alive on the campus of Acadia University. I'd like to begin this lecture with a story. Educators have learned over the years that storytelling is a useful pedagogical tool, since it invites people to engage very quickly with the lesson to be studied. The story I wish to share was written a long time ago, but is, in my opinion, very relevant to today and to the topic at hand in this lecture series. The story was crafted by a writer called Matthew. I quote directly from him. After the transfiguration on the mountain, Jesus, Peter, James, and John were rejoining the crowds when a man came up to Jesus and went down on his knees before him. "Lord," he said, "take pity on my son. He is a lunatic and in a wretched state. He is always falling into the fire or into the water. I took him to your disciples, but they were unable to cure him." "Faithless and perverse generation," Jesus said in reply, "how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me." And when Jesus rebuked it, the devil came out of the boy, who was cured at that moment. Then the disciples came privately to Jesus. "Why were we unable to cast it out?" they asked. He answered, "Because you have little faith. I tell you solemnly, if your faith were the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it would move. Nothing would be impossible for you." If this story were written today, I suspect that the only change might be the word lunatic. In this very old story, it is apparent that faith is a very powerful force in life. It would seem that a very small amount of it can do remarkable things. For the next few moments, I would like to examine with you where I think we are as a society in relation to faith, what our main concerns are in relation to faith, and where we need to look for direction regarding these concerns. I'd like to provide the beginnings of a psychological and spiritual perspective on the topic of faith. A psychological perspective must take into account a discussion of the person as a thinking, feeling, behaving being. And the spiritual perspective must include the psychological along with a discussion of purpose, meaning, wholeness, or integrity as related to individual persons and community of persons. I should perhaps state my central point at the outset and provide some guidelines for my discussion. I think that as a society, we need to examine in what and in whom we have put our faith. We need to ask ourselves whether our findings warrant a continued confidence in our choice or whether we need to choose another course of action. This is our postmodern dilemma: to maintain our present direction or to choose another. My conclusion is fairly straightforward. I think that as a society, we are in need of a faith which will address our sense of alienation and discouragement and help us to regain our sense of integrity, of wholeness as persons and as community of persons. By way of an outline for my argument, I would propose a cursory examination of the context in which our current dilemma has developed. I shall talk briefly about the tension between religion and science, since the former has been the home and defender of faith, and the latter the architect of the technological age in which we live. In this discussion, I shall attempt to show that the traditional debate between science and religion can be seen as an ongoing tension within persons, a tension between the mind and the heart. This discussion about the split between the mind and the heart should lead to the second section of this presentation, which provides for a psychological perspective on faith. I will examine relationships as the foundation of faith and propose a psychology of interdependence, not a psychology of individualism. The third section of the presentation provides for the spirituality of faith by discussing community as a way to regain our integrity, our wholeness as persons, thus providing us with an authentic faith that affects all aspects of our lives. I will draw on the inspiration of a number of writers from various disciplines, including philosophy, theology, and psychology. In a special way, I want to acknowledge the work of the late Professor John McMurray, a philosopher and Christian of the Protestant tradition, whose work is now having a profound impact in the area of social science. Professor McMurray will assist me with many parts of my argument. Educators have, in addition to storytelling, other pedagogical tools. One such tool gives the audience key words that will be used throughout the presentation. Here are the key words you can look for in this presentation: faith, fear, fellowship. Faith, or trust, is the spiritual foundation upon which all else rests. Fear, or mistrust, is the opposite of faith, and fellowship is the resolution of fear. Another three words that capture the essence of my presentation are communion, alienation, and community. Communion, or faith in action, is the foundation upon which all else rests. Alienation is the opposite of communion, and community is the resolution of alienation. In our contemporary culture, we are increasingly aware of our disillusionment regarding our political, social, economic, and religious structures. We are aware of serious divisions and inequities in our society, and many people are now questioning how these divisions and inequities will be resolved. Our society is in desperate need of a principle of valuation, a faith, a hope, a spiritual center from which we can decide what is most worth having in life for all of humanity. Without a faith that respects the integrity and wholeness of persons and community, we shall be without intention and unity of purpose, and we shall remain at the mercy of external forces that do not have our spiritual welfare as their reason for being. As Professor McMurray writes, until we find a faith to live by, life will be too much for us, and we shall lack the power to act decisively. But a faith is not something we can force upon ourselves. It must touch us in every aspect of our being. It must make itself credible in all the circumstances of our daily lives. It must, in short, be real. It must be a faith that we can live by and that makes life thoroughly worth living. It must be a faith that integrates our minds and our hearts and provides purpose and meaning to our lives. Any dilemma, that is, a choice between alternatives, can be dealt with in a number of ways. We could run away from the dilemma and not make a choice. We could quickly, without much analysis or discernment, make a choice. Or we could face the dilemma head on. Many of us would like to avoid the necessity of making a choice, so we try to persuade ourselves that everything is all right. We talk about how complicated and complex the world has become, and we excuse ourselves from making a choice or deciding to act. We have become numb. Professor McMurray puts it this way: we have lost our faith, and when we lose our faith, we lose our capacity of choice. We lose the power of action. We lose our grip on reality, and so our sanity. Have you noticed lately the difference between what you believe and what you feel? We believe in democracy, but we're aware of how undemocratic we can be. We believe in progress, but we are not convinced that everything cited to be progress is in fact so. We believe in justice and equity, but are aware of how unjust and unequal we can be. We believe in institutions to serve people, but we are aware of institutions' self-serving interests. Our ideals, our visions, our dreams of possibilities seem remote at best. Even our churches are housed with people who assent to certain beliefs and perform their duties religiously, but do not necessarily experience a living, authentic faith integrated into their lives to be shared with others. The dilemma we are experiencing shows itself as a split between our minds and our hearts, between our imagination and our feelings. Notice how we refer to the age in which we live. Some refer to it as the postmodern age, or the age of science and technology. Others refer to it as the age of information. Critics refer to it as the age of materialism or the age of discouragement. One high school valedictorian recently referred to it as the age of confusion. The confusion is this: how can some parts of the world be so rich and other parts so poor? How can we have so much knowledge and not be able to solve our problems? Why do we feel so incapacitated to act? Why does there seem to be such a split between our intellectual and emotional lives? Why are so many people in psychological and spiritual turmoil if we are making such progress technologically? Perhaps the dilemma we have to face is in the detachment of our emotional life from our intellectual conclusions. Let us look at science and religion for a brief moment to see if our dilemma becomes clearer. As you are aware, there's been a long-standing battle between science and religion, and the popular perception is that science is winning. But can we wholeheartedly believe in both science and religion? Professor McMurray answers the question this way. The scientific spirit and the religious spirit in us are subtly antagonistic and tend to negate one another, so our capacity for decision and action is paralyzed. We cannot surrender either, and the effort to believe in both at once results in our believing effectively in neither. We look to science for our knowledge of the physical world, and now the psychological world. We are committed to science, to the discovery of facts and knowledge. But we cannot wholeheartedly embrace science, for we know that science can be used for good or evil purposes. And we are not proposing to put our faith in individual scientists. Even if we put our faith in science, there are persons who use the discoveries of science for their own purposes. And surely we have serious reservations about putting our faith in these persons. We are reluctant to abandon religion completely, since we look to religion for a value base upon which to direct our lives. But religion has been on the defensive. While many people have not given up their belief in God, many have given up their belief in organized religion. Some have left in search of a new age spirituality, where they can be more imaginatively connected to their experience. Some are simply angry and bitter at what they see as a dead institutional tradition waiting to be buried. It is apparent to many that religion is in need of transformation, if it is to respond to the questions and concerns of contemporary people searching for purpose and meaning. The conflict is not between scientist and clergy, or even between science and religion as abstract concepts, since these are only words. The conflict is within us. We know the value of the scientific spirit and the value of the religious spirit, and they are pulling us apart. Science can provide the means for achieving what we want to achieve, but who will decide what is good, right, and worthwhile to achieve? In 1932, Professor McMurray wrote, "We shall use science to get what we want, and to do what we feel most worth doing. And if we believe, and if we begin to feel that nothing is really worth doing, we shall use science to amuse ourselves and to distract our minds from the deadly boredom of living a life that has lost its meaning because we have lost our faith." In 1985, Professor Neil Postman, a communications theorist from New York University, titled his book, "Amusing Ourselves to Death," the central point being the fulfillment of McMurray's prophetic words. Postman shows that as a culture, we are exposed in our contemporary media systems with either the trivial or the tragic. The separation of our minds and hearts is too much to bear. So we distract ourselves, hoping that the pain of separation can be ignored or eased while we wait for what we do not know. Science is an activity governed by the intellectual pursuit of hard facts and evidence of life as it is discovered and known. We associate science with the intellectual domain because the powers of thinking and reasoning required of the scientific method come from the intellectual domain. Faith requires thinking and reasoning as well, but is associated more with the emotional and intuitive area, since it drives our whole being, including the intellect. In the last century, there has been an immense development of knowledge which we can attribute to science. We can say, perhaps, that our intellects are developing, but our emotional life has not kept pace with our intellectual growth. Professor McMurray puts it this way: knowledge is power, but emotion is the master of our values and of the uses, therefore, to which we put our power. Emotionally, we are primitive, childish, and undeveloped. We have the tastes, appetites, interests, and apprehensions of children, but we have in our hands a vast set of powers which are the product of our intellectual development. We are beginning to be afraid of the work of our hands. This is our modern dilemma. We have set the intellect free and kept emotion in chains. We have learned to trust ourselves to think, but we have refused to trust ourselves to feel. We have learned to look facts in the face, but not to look values in the face. We are beginning to know ourselves, says McMurray, and it is a process that hurts, that disillusions. Philosophers talk about different kinds of knowledge. Technical knowledge, that is how to do things. Valuational knowledge, that is knowledge about values. And communal knowledge, that is knowledge about relationships. I think it is apparent that we have in this century focused on one kind of knowledge to the exclusion of the other two. To have so much technical knowledge without a well-established value base and a sensitivity to the importance of relationships, both human and environmental, is indeed a dangerous state. Science can do many things. Whether science should be doing all that it can do is not a scientific question, but a religious question. If religion is to survive, it must be real. That is, it must provide for the integrity, for the wholeness of persons and community. It must unify the intellectual and emotional sides of our nature into a way of living. Real religion is about facing our fears and not defending ourselves against the world. To demand security is the expression of fear, and a religion that offers security is fear determined. We are in need of a faith that will address the fear that paralyzes us from action. We are afraid of ourselves, afraid of one another, afraid of God, afraid of the consequences of any decisive action. We have isolated ourselves, and our isolation makes us more fearful. Let me summarize the first section of this presentation by saying that I believe as a society we have lost the path to an authentic faith. As a society, we recognize now the religious and scientific uncertain state in which we find ourselves. And we do not know anymore in what or in whom we should put our faith. The long-standing debate between science and religion presents itself in our consciousness as a conflict between our minds and our hearts. We cannot choose between our minds and our hearts, since what we need is the integration of both our intellectual and emotional lives. We are searching for a faith that will resolve this dilemma for us. It will have to be a faith that addresses both facts and values, a faith that confronts the question of fear and shows direction in resolving it. In addressing the question of fear, I need to examine briefly the nature of relationships. Through this examination, we should be able to find the beginnings of a psychological perspective on faith. Psychologists have contributed to our understanding of human development. Noted in particular is the work of Erik Erikson. In his description of various stages of psychological and social development, Professor Erikson proposes that trust is the first stage. Our observations and reflections would confirm this insight. When a child is born, the child is at the mercy of an adult who may or may not respond to her or his needs. A child cries to communicate that there is a need or a want. If the adult responds, the child begins to trust. That is, have faith that the adult will respond to the next cry. If the cry is not answered or is answered in a manner that is aggressive, the child begins to doubt. That is, begins to fear that the adult is not trustworthy. Children reared in an environment where they are assisted in resolving the conflict between trust and doubt, or faith and fear, grow up to be cautious but trusting adults. Those who do not trust grow up fearful of the world, and if fortunate, find another environment where they can begin to trust. The point I wish to make here is that the foundation of faith or trust is relational. That is, it is with and through other people that we learn about faith or trust. Fear is very much part of relationships. The child is afraid that her or his cry will not be answered. This is another way of saying that the fear of the child is the fear of rejection or abandonment. How the child's cry is answered determines to a large extent how the child will develop. If the cry is responded to in a way that communicates, "I am here, I hear your cry, I know you hurt," the child is not only comforted but confirmed in its being. If the message is communicated, "You are a nuisance, I don't care," then the child grows in fear. It is not surprising that many psychologists talk about the importance of bonding in human relationships. This is another way of saying that emotional intimacy is important. Erik Erikson, Sigmund Freud, and others have informed us of the importance of bonding in the first few years of life. Our experience informs us that emotional bonding or intimacy between two persons is a fragile reality. There are times the child and parent are in communion with one another, and other times when there is a distance, when communion breaks down and there is the experience of separation. As children grow and develop, there arises the need to maintain communion while growing in autonomy. That is, the child needs to grow as a distinct person, separate from the parent, but in communion with the parent. The healthy parent recognizes the tension between communion and separateness and rears the child accordingly. Our earliest experience of faith is, therefore, faith in a person, someone who is there with us and for us, someone who will guide us and teach us, who will share our pain and our joy. This is communion, a covenant between two people based on faith or trust. The child has faith that the parent will be there for her or him without knowing this with certainty. The parent has faith that the child will mature and grow in ways that are healthy for both the child and society, but the parent does not know this with certainty. The child and the parent experience communion through human gestures, the way the parent and child interact, how they look at one another, how they touch, how they listen to each other, indicate whether communion is experienced or not. Of course, it is not possible or even desirable to meet all the needs of the child on demand. Here we enter the problem of doubt or mistrust. If the need of the child is not met, the child begins to doubt, mistrust, or lack faith in the parent's desire to respond. Infants are not busy rationalizing the actions of a parent. If their needs are not met, they are worried or fearful that this may be a recurring pattern. Now the child and the parent are faced with the tension between affirmation and challenge. On the one hand, the child needs to be valued and affirmed in all its being. On the other hand, the child needs to be challenged to grow, challenged to wait for a need to be met, challenged to see itself not as the center, but a part of the universe. If the child is sufficiently affirmed and appropriately challenged, then the child will grow in faith or trust. In this way, faith is communicated to the child by the parent. If the parent has faith in the child, then the child begins to develop faith in her or himself. As the child grows to trust her or his ability to think, to feel, and to act, the child can begin to trust others. Jean Vanier, one of the best-known contemporary spiritual leaders, recounts a story about trust that I shall quote from his book, Images of Love, Words of Hope. In 1942, I was much affected by the war, and I said to my father that I wanted to join the Navy. This was a difficult period of the war. Many ships from Canada and England were being sunk. I was 13 then. It meant that in order to enter a naval academy, I would have to cross the Atlantic. I remember my father saying to me, "Well, come and see me in my office." I was a little bit scared because we children would never go to see him in the office. I went, and he said, "Explain to me what it is you really want and why you want to join the Navy." I forget what I said, but when I had finished, I remember his answer. He said, "I trust you, and if that is what you want, well then, that is what you must do." I did not realize at the time, says Vanier, but that was probably one of the most healing moments of my life. Because my father, whom I loved and admired, trusted me, then I could begin to trust myself. Had he said, "That's childish, you're too young, wait for 4 years, and then you can join the Navy," I would have accepted that. My own intuition to what I should do was so fragile. I wouldn't have rebelled, but I would have lost trust in my own deep intuition and in my own desire. I believe that desire came from a holy point or a holy part of my being. It came from the sanctuary of my being. Because my father said, "I trust that intuition, I trust that your desire is a holy desire, a desire that comes from what is right and from what is good," then I could trust in myself. While there are many parts of this story worthy of comment, I share it here to illustrate the point that faith, trust, or confidence is communicated from one person to another. I'm using faith here in a generic sense, although one can conclude from Vanier's story that religious faith was an integral part of the exchange between father and son. Jean Vanier acknowledges the fear inherent in the parent-child relationship, the fear that he would not be understood, the fear that his own intuition would not count for much. Fear is in the very nature and structure of any interaction. The basis of fear is an emotional disconnectedness with another person. We fear isolation and alienation because our roots are in relationship. The foundation of faith and fear is relationship. The notion of emotional connectedness is so important in a child's life that the child will go to great ends to achieve it. Many children will do virtually anything to win the approval and affection of their parents. On the other hand, they have their own inner desires and intuitions, as we heard from Vanier's story. And this is a great tension experienced by both parent and child. Those who give up their own wishes to please the parent sacrifice much of themselves. Those who give up their desire to please the parent sacrifice an emotional connectedness, at least until this tension is resolved to some degree of satisfaction. Many children overachieve to win the affection of the parent. It is as though they are saying, "If you don't love me for who I am, then you will admire me for what I do." Still other children fall into a kind of depression as they give up trying to win the approval of the parent. This discussion of parent-child relationships is largely psychological in nature and is an attempt to provide for us an understanding that the foundation of faith is relationship or communion, and that the essential problem in relationships is the question of fear. Fear is the opposite of faith, and like faith, is part and parcel of every relationship. Let me try to summarize our discussion to this point. In the first part of my lecture, I tried to show that we are in need of a faith that will help us integrate our minds and our hearts. In the second part of the lecture, I've tried to show on a psychological level that fear is an integral part of human interaction and has its roots in early childhood. Now that we know something of the nature and importance of faith and fear, we can now move on to the third section, since the question of fear must be addressed and resolved if we desire a faith that will help us to rediscover our integrity, our wholeness as persons and as community. I am proposing that the resolution of fear is fellowship, or in other words, community, or in the language of the Gospels, love. At the outset, I should clarify that I am not using these terms in a romantic or even idealistic sense. Remember Karl Marx's critique of religion as blinding us to our human condition. I refer to these terms, fellowship, community, and love, as very real and demanding, rooted and tested in human relationships. Romance has its place in human relationships, but not in this particular lecture. For I would not want to give you the impression that I have a cozy or warm connotation of these terms. I have experienced community sufficiently to know that there are few more demanding realities. And I know, as you do, that there is no more demanding reality than to love another for the other's sake. But let me proceed with my argument that love needs to overcome fear if we are to gain a faith that will serve us well. Three of the more important themes in the Gospels are faith, fear, and love. We hear less about faith than fear and love. We hear about a faithless generation, but we also hear about individuals whose faith makes them well. We hear often the words, "Be not afraid." It is as though Jesus recognized fear as an important dimension of the human condition and exhorted that fear be challenged head-on. We hear even more often the phrase, "Love one another." It may be that this exhortation is meant to help with what appears to be an abundance of fear and a lack of faith. So I think it is worth exploring the notion that faith, that love, or if you like, fellowship or community, is the place we need to look for direction to resolve the issue of fear in our ongoing effort to determine in what and in whom we should put our faith. A noted social scientist, Robert Nisbet, concluded that among the significant movements of the 20th century, two in particular are noteworthy since they are in such conflict with each other. One movement he described as an interior movement, that is, a quest for community on the part of people. This was not so much an intellectual quest as it was an emotional quest to be connected with people. This has a similar ring to theologian Paul Tillich's concern that ours is an age of meaninglessness. The second and conflicting movement, noted by Nisbet, was the political, social, and economic undermining of community. That is, the forces around people yearning for community would militate against community. We would not be hard-pressed to provide examples of Nisbet's thesis. It might also be that religious forces, through overemphasizing otherworldliness and individual salvation, have neglected the very core of religion, which is to establish, maintain, and support structures that promote people in positive personal relationship with one another and with God. Community remains a very important concept, even though many people, including many Christians, have given up on it. And it is not surprising that while our hearts may long for more communion or community, our efforts at realizing what we need fall short of the mark. There are reasons for this. As I argued earlier, Our society has developed in the area of science and technology. But as I shared earlier, there are other forms of knowledge, including values and community. Since we have not learned much in these areas, it is not surprising that we do not try to create community, or that we give up on community at the first or second sign of conflict. For real community is like real religion. It requires lessons in managing conflict, since relationships, as we discovered in an earlier part of this lecture, are not only about communion, but about conflict. It is interesting to note here that the well-known psychiatrist Scott Peck distinguishes between pseudo-community and real community. Pseudo-community is like the club or the mutual admiration society, where honesty and conflict are avoided. Real community is more rare and demands much patience, humility, and forgiveness. The word community connotes different images for people. For some, it is a live-in arrangement where everything is shared according to need. For others, it is a network of people working towards a similar goal. For still others, it is sharing particular aspects of their lives with other people in similar circumstances. The common dimension to these images is that people gather together to share, to come to know one another, and to care for one another. In relation to this lecture on faith, I want to speak about small faith-sharing communities because I find potential there to help us address the question of faith. Our discussion has brought us to a point where I can suggest that the psychological perspective I wish to propose is a psychology of interdependence. Hopefully, the days of individualism are numbered. The foundation of faith is relational. We need each other if we are to mature in faith or trust. We need to act in relation to one another in a manner that promotes the dignity and well-being of the other. But our psychology is a science, and if you agree with my earlier discussion, you will see that science cannot provide a faith for us. It can only show us how to get what we want. What we want must be determined by our values. The spirituality I am proposing is a communal spirituality based on the values of the Gospels. One way to discover these values and develop lifestyles that reflect these values is through small faith communities. There are many examples of these communities around the world, and we should be encouraged by their development. These communities provide a format and an environment where gospel values can be discerned and where faith in these values can be nurtured. If these communities are sufficiently inclusive, they can provide a variety of perspectives and insights into the meaning of the Gospels in today's world. While the numbers of people and frequency of meetings vary from group to group, they are typically no more than 10 or 12 people meeting weekly or every other week. This kind of format allows for interaction and process, both of which are important if people are going to experience real community. Typically, these groups have time for personal faith sharing, prayer, and discussion. Faith sharing is important because it helps one to reflect on and articulate one's faith story as an integral part of one's personal story. We begin to develop the language of faith and discover new words to describe the experience of consolation and desolation in our lives. As trust in the community develops, people feel more open, more free to be open and vulnerable, and begin to accept themselves as others accept them. The sharing of one's faith journey needs to be heard and respected, and one learns as one listens to others' stories. Prayer is an important component of these faith communities, for through prayer the group acknowledges its reliance on God and people learn the importance of silence as a means of listening to and discerning the presence of God in their personal and communal lives. Through prayer and contemplation, the interior life of the individual and the interior life of the group are acknowledged and nurtured. Discussion is also an important part of the faith community, since it is imperative that people learn to discern the values of the gospel and the values of the culture in which they live and where these values conflict. The community needs to grow in its critical awareness of political, social, economic, and religious structures that promote human dignity and freedom, and of structures that do not. The community also needs to discern whether it is called to act in faith in denouncing structures contrary to the values of the gospel and denouncing structures that promote the same values. Learning to discern individually and collectively is an obviously important dimension to faith communities, since the spirituality I am proposing here is an active one that is discernible and discoverable. The need for community in this regard is critical, since we need the insight, support, and sometimes challenge of other people if we're going to allow every aspect of our lives to be affected by this spirituality. While the activities of particular individuals and groups will vary according to their discernment, it is clear that a Christian spirituality has as its mandate the building of the kingdom of heaven on earth. This was the instruction of Jesus in the prayer, Our Father. This mission was so important to him that he was ready to die for it. It is noteworthy, isn't it, that he left this mission to a small group of followers he inspired and trained and with whom he shared. The message is that God is intimately involved in human activity and that we are to discern this and cooperate with this. For Jesus, community was open to those who yearned for an experience of the living God, those who recognized their need, whose hearts were open, and who desired communion. And he found most of these people in the poor. Jesus prepared well the first community. There was, I believe, a twofold aspect to community. The first aspect was relational. People were instructed to care for one another, respect one another where the last would be first. The second aspect was missionary. People were to be involved in the world in ways that would build God's kingdom. Jesus had first-hand experience about how difficult this task would be, which is why he trained his followers to care for one another and encourage one another. Jesus sees the importance of community as a living force to transform the world. He saw this at a time when military power was used to transform the world. This has a familiar ring for us in the 20th century. Jesus recognized that the real power of people was in their coming together, acknowledging their need for one another as they attempt to live the good news. This power is not, of course, the worldly sense of power over others, but power that comes from a need to be in communion with one another and with God. This is faith, believing, trusting, and acting in ways that speak of God's intimate involvement in our activities. Faith is a movement, a break from the familiar past, and a march into the unknown future. Abraham apparently started his faith journey at age 75, when he heard the words, "Get thee out." Faith does not reveal, of course, the end of the journey, but keeps it hidden and remote. The attitude of faith seems to be one step at a time. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read that Paul was told, "Get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you have to do." Abraham was told, "Get out, Paul was told, get up. The idea is to move, to act, to do something, and then wait to be told what to do next. This is faith, trust, moving one step at a time. Every journey into the unknown is an act of faith. It demands more each time and is kept alive by the trials of life. Carlos Valdez, a well-known Jesuit and psychologist, writes, faith is the bridge that spans the credibility gap between what is and what should be, what our eyes see and what our hearts believe, between present and future, between heaven and earth. Paul, the first theologian, writes in Hebrews, faith is the assurance of our hope, the proof of the things we do not see. True faith is believing and trusting that God is intimately involved in each moment of our existence, and it is within a communal reality that this belief and trust are nurtured. So like Abraham and Paul, it is time for us to get up and go, at least out of this lecture hall. But before we do, let me summarize my reflections on the topic of faith. You will recall the words faith, fear, and fellowship, and the words communion, alienation, and community. We need a faith that will help us to rediscover our integrity, our wholeness as persons and as community of persons. We need to make decisions and to act according to a value base. The foundation of faith is communion between and among people. We know that love and fear are the motivating forces in relationships and community. We know also that fear is the opposite of faith, and that love is the resolution of fear. When I reflect on the question of faith in what and in whom, I find purpose, meaning, and direction in the person and message of Jesus Christ, that a faith-filled community is the force to transform the world.